inhaling little particles. I got to get a new mask. Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and again, welcome. Last night, I took the experiences of a life, the events that took place with Seymour Biles, and I talked about them as a Torah for us, that she had much to teach us and to teach us in lessons in relation to success, in relation to competition, and particularly what it has to do with human vulnerability. Today, I'm going to do something a little bit different, and although I've done this before under more normal circumstances, I'm going to try to do it through Zoom and with all of you who are present here. And that is, I want to teach a text and bring the text to life as opposed to a life to a text. So I'm going to be referring specifically to a psalm which is found on page 97 in your Sidurim. So although I don't want you to get lost in this psalm before we get to it, you might get it ready for when we do get to it. Okay. If I were to ask you to consider what is an ideal religious Jew, I know that I would get a lot of different answers. If I were to ask you to consider what's an ideal religious person, I would get a lot of different answers also. But by and large, people would say things like, if you're a good person, you're a religious person. Right? If you do good deeds, you are a religious person. If you connect in some way to ritual, you may be on your way to being a religious person. Throughout my life, I have learned that the great Rambam, the Maimonides of the 12th century, taught about two kinds of religious models, two types of religious ideals. One he referred to as the Chacham, the wise person. The wise person is engaged in scholarship and teaching. The wise person learns. The wise person is a posek, can take a matter of Jewish law and determine how it should be played out. The wise person interprets text. The other type of religious leader, according to Rambam, is a tzaddik, person of righteousness in action, doing that which is just. And as you know, the word tzaddik is certainly related to tzedakah, which we can understand as charitable, righteous deeds, but it's also justice. This week I read an article by Rabbi Mark Angel, and I found another possibility. And it's a possibility that I think fills the gap between the Chacham and the Tzaddik as the just person. And I believe it's needed for religious life, religious living, religious models today. The model is known as the Adik, or the pious person. And so a distinction is made between a righteous person and a pious person. And we'll see that it represents a very different model from the Chacham. Angel pointed out that in this week's magnificent Torah portion, we are reminded that God does justice on behalf of the orphan and the widow. He loves the stranger, and he provides food and clothing. The implication is that we too need to emulate those ideals, the compassionate qualities of God. You might say, if you looked at those texts in Dvarim, which is chapter 10, verse 18, and what comes afterwards, it would form the basis of an attitude towards an immigration policy, caring for those who need assistance, for those who need protection. On the festivals and on the holy days, when we stand in front of the Aron Kodesh, You're all familiar with the fact that the cantor leads us, singing the 13 attributes of God. It's always a very touching moment. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, Erech Hapayim V'Rav Chesed V'Emet. The cantor and congregation sing. And we repeat the words. God is merciful, gracious, patient, filled with kindness, and truthful. Why? The answer is that we emphasize these qualities because what we learn is that if God is merciful, then we should try to be merciful. If God is gracious, then we should try to be gracious. If God is patient, we should be patient. If God is filled with kindness, we should be kind. This theme of God's mercy is also found in the Psalm, in Psalm 146, that you can find on page 97. In listing his attributes, now, if you'll take a look from the 5th stanza down, where it says, God keeps faith forever. God brings justice to the oppressed. He provides food for the hungry. He frees the bound. He gives sight to the blind. He raises those who are bowed down, and he gives love to the righteous. It's translated here as just, but in the Hebrew it's Adonai Ohev Tzadikim. God loves the Tzadikim. It then goes on to state God watches over strangers and upholds the orphan and widow. The pattern of the phrases is to describe a person who has a particular need or deficiency. The person is oppressed. The person is hungry. The person is bound. The person is blind. The person is bowed. People in a weak social position, the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. And then it indicates that God, the gracious God, the loving God, resolves these and restores these people to fullness. Ironically, though, in what doesn't seem to make quite as much sense as that embedded in here, it says God loves the just, or God loves the righteous. So let us be chachamim right now. Let's be good scholars. What is the phrase, God loves the righteous, doing in the midst of these descriptions? Is there something that we're not getting here? Because all the other phrases, as I mentioned, refer to some human need, deficiency, or failure. Hungry, they're fed. The bound, they're released. The blind, they're given sight. The oppressed, they're given justice. The righteous, they're given love. So perhaps the text then is coming to teach us something really important about the righteous. And that is, the righteous may be lacking something. Why? Because it's so easy for the righteous to become self-righteous. It's so easy for those who uphold justice to forget mercy. On one hand, righteous people often know that they live with very high principles. They're not always a beloved person because of that. People don't necessarily like those who set themselves apart, and they see them as being self-righteous. Or they don't like people who stand in criticism of the lifestyles or the opinions of others who don't match up to what they see as the model of righteous living. So one way to understand this is the following. The righteous person might feel isolated, lonely, and unloved. You know what it's like when you're with a group of people who are either doing something or speaking about something, and there's some calling inside of you that's thinking, what they're saying is wrong, or what they're doing we shouldn't be doing. And yet it's very difficult to stand up because we feel like we will be alienated by virtue of that. So one understanding is that the righteous can take comfort in the fact that although they may not be the most popular people, God will love them. The divine love makes up for the deficiency of human love that they experience. But there's another interpretation. Not that the righteous are deprived of the love of others, but rather the righteous, those who stand for justice, can lack the ability to have compassion for others. A just person follows the rules carefully and does what is right. In being committed to the rules, they can sometimes become disdainful of others who aren't quite as meticulous. We see that a lot with people who show or claim to be religiously observant, don't we? It comes often, religious observance too often comes with a judgment of others as if they're not living right. The righteous person becomes characterized by a love of rules, not by a love of humanity. Indeed, those people who do not conform to the standards of righteousness often become objects of scorn or disgust. In some ways, I think it exists today in other aspects of human behavior, like those who eat well, eat healthy, and the way they look at those of us who like French fries, or those who are exercising and thin, and the way they look at those who aren't quite there. It takes a good deal of self-awareness to be able to be comfortable in where you stand without becoming too judgmental of others. So the Talmud relates in a very strange passage about a father who prays on behalf of his sick son. If the father says that he will give charity to God if his son will be healed soon, the father is considered to be righteous. Yet this prayer seems to be less than ideal because we wonder, why should the father be considered to be righteous when he makes a bargain with God? A Talmudist halachist in the 18th century by the name of Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai commented on this passage. It gives a clue to the issue with the righteous person, with the tzaddik. He says he is a tzaddik, but he's not a adik. He's not pious. And he creates this differentiation between a righteous person and a pious person. He's righteous in that he strikes a bargain and meets the terms exactly. He hasn't deviated from any rules. Yet he's not pious because his attitude reflects a lower level of religiosity, according to Azulai. It lacks a love of God, a true love of God, which brings trust. A righteous person may not even realize that righteousness does not necessarily make the pious person. A just person can be cold, calculating, unsympathetic, and follow the rules meticulously. Such a person, according to Azulai, lacks adikut, piety, a love of God, a love of his fellow human beings, which is reflected in a love of God. Such a person is devoted to the rules, but not devoted to living by the ideals that transcend the rules. So the psalmist lists the deficiency, as you see on the page, of the righteous as being a deficiency of love. It's really interesting. A deficiency in his or her ability to live with a loving attitude towards human beings and towards God. So God here intercedes and teaches the righteous person also to love. When the Bible describes God's love and compassion, his concern for the weak and the downtrodden, it's presenting a model to emulate. Just as God is kind, we are to be kind. Just as God is merciful, we are to be merciful. The program in our religious life may be to do that which is right, but the essence of our religious life must be to do that which is imbued with grace, with compassion, and with love. Why do we love the stranger? Because God loved the stranger. So we come together to pray. We come together to study. We come together to do acts of charity. We want chachma. We need wisdom. And we're obligated to tzedakah. But we learned and we are now encouraged to do it with piety. And to do it with piety, we have to approach other human beings and this world with open hearts. In other words, we do it with love. Our goal then, the religious goal, is not just to be hachamim, not just to be wise people, not just to be tzaddikim, but to be adikim, to be pious people. And to be pious people entails the qualities of empathy, compassion, and sincere love. Shabbat Shalom. Turn to page 155 as we begin the Musaf service with the Chatzi Kaddish. Please rise.